Morning, everybody. Welcome to the On Track Live. Let's give it just 1 second here. We still got some people joining up. Great. Looks like we've got some, and we'll probably have more folks joining here shortly. And as a reminder to everybody, we record all of these On Track Live sessions. So if your schedule ever doesn't match up and you need to, you can always catch up later with the recording links that Melinda has. Thank everybody who is able to attend on this August date. We'll start with just a couple of quick updates before we introduce our special guest today and begin the conversation. Want to remind everybody that the NCTA fall meeting and 50th anniversary celebration is right around the corner, coming up September 10th and 11th in Tucson, Arizona. Beautiful venue. The Hacienda del Sol used to be a Catholic girls' school. Very cool place. We've got a good crowd. I think close to 20 utilities and coal burners represented at the meeting, so a lot of customers to talk to, and a pretty good lineup of speakers, including STB member Patrick Fuchs. We've got the chief economist from the Association of American Railroads. We've got Steve Gorham, who's an excellent speaker on energy transition issues. And we'll also be talking some about some emerging issues around coal dust. So it's going to be a really good meeting in Tucson. If you haven't already made arrangements to come, you can still, there's still room. You can still get in. Encourage everybody to come and join up. There's also still sponsorship opportunities available. We'll be both larger sponsorships and the golf holes. We'll be golfing at the Lowe's Ventana Resort, beautiful resort on the north side of Tucson there. So reach out to Melinda, please, if you've been remiss and haven't got your sponsorships lined up. Along those same lines, wanted to let everybody know about a change we're making at NCTA. Our digital On Track newsletter that comes out every 2 weeks has been going to a pretty wide audience now. We're in September after the Tucson meeting. We're going to change the digital On Track newsletter to be a members and sponsors only resource. So any of you who have, if any of you are not members or sponsors, you'll be getting some notifications about that. Real easy, sponsorships are very affordable. Sponsor something at the conference, we'll put your name back on the list. But I just wanted to let everybody know that if you get one of those emails, it means we need to do something to keep you around. So always encourage sponsorship to support the organization. Not a whole lot of news updates. One news update I guess I'll throw out there is it's not an issue that's quite as big for the coal shippers, but one of the accomplishments the Surface Transportation Board has been able to get done in the last couple of years of being very active was a rule for a final offer rate review, which was the STB's effort to make a streamlined rate case, if you will, to try to cut down on the millions of dollars you would have to spend to challenge rates before the STB. Unfortunately, that rule that the STB got struck down by the 8th Circuit Court. Got struck down by the 8th Circuit Court this week. So we'll have some information about that in tomorrow's email On Track newsletter. The other thing we'll be reporting on in tomorrow's On Track newsletter is the upcoming hearings before STB. The new STB, the new STB chairman has called a 2-day in-person hearing to grill the Class 1 railroads on what they're doing to try to grow volume on their networks. And NCTA will be participating, or NCTA has participated with the Freight Rail Customer Alliance in submitting some written comments on that. We'll have a link to those written comments for you in tomorrow's On Track. And Emily Regas, the NCTA president, will be appearing in person also for those hearings that are coming up in September in Washington with the STB. So watch the newsletter for more details about all of that. That's probably enough of me flapping my gums and shameless self-promotion for now. We'll get back to the discussion here. Remind everybody, I've got the chat box open. This can be a discussion. So if you've got questions as we go along or comments to make, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that, or else do the wavy hand thing that you can do with Zoom or unmute or whatever. Feel free to join in if you have questions. I'm really happy to have with us today Tawny Bridgeford. Tawny's the General Counsel and Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs over at National Mining Association. Tawny's one of the brightest folks in town for keeping track of a dizzying number of regulations and proposed regulations. It's overwhelming the amount of stuff that she deals with, and I've always been impressed how she can keep track of all that. So I invited Tawny to come chat with us a little bit about the thing that a lot of people are talking about now, the Chevron decision that came out of the Supreme Court. But we can also get into what the outlook is for all those other rules that the Biden administration has pushed out in the last 9 months or so, and what else is still on the plate may still be to come if depending on the outcome of the election this November. So anyway, thank you, Tawny, for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. Maybe I could just throw it to you to give a quick summary of what Chevron is and what Chevron did, because I think that's probably the top of mind for most of the people on the call here today.
Happy to do that, and very kind introduction. The dizzying amount of regulations that National Mining Association monitors, engages in. Just to give you just a brief stat, we were looking at over 100 regulations during this first, the Biden administration writ large. And I'm just one person here at NMA. We have a big team, so appreciate the kudos, but certainly have a great team here supporting me. But Chevron certainly has been top of mind. If you're a lawyer in town and you're practicing administrative law, when that case came out, everyone was scrambling to read it as soon as it hit the internet, right? And there have been so many webinars, so many articles written from many different law firms and organizations. I've been trying to keep up with all of that because I think certainly everyone has a little bit of a different perspective on how that really will play out in the regulatory space and how it may curb agency discretion moving forward and how they apply their authority through all the various statutes that they administer. But as a backdrop, if folks aren't familiar with Chevron, this was a doctrine that's been around for 40 years, Supreme Court doctrine. This was a Reagan era Clean Air Act case. And actually, the outcome was beneficial for industry and it was adverse to environmental organizations. But I think over the 40 years since the decision was made, really the Chevron doctrine turned into be something that folks thought that was almost close to an automatic pass to an agency, that if a statute was ambiguous, that as long as the agency's policy decision, that their interpretation was reasonable, even if a court could have come out a different way, the agency was allowed to do what it wanted to do. And I think that caused a lot of concern amongst, regulated communities like the mining industry and others. It's really hard to win those cases if the agency was determined to be reasonable in its actions. So if you couldn't win that case at step one, which is that the Congress directly spoke to the precise issue at question using traditional ways of looking at statutes, if you couldn't win there and that didn't support your cause and you ended up in step two, it was just very difficult to win those cases. I saw some interesting stats recently. There was like a 2017 study that showed that overall the agency win rate across all Court of Appeals in the United States was approximately 77% under Chevron. And if you looked at cases that just involved energy issues, the court applied Chevron almost in every case, 96%. And the relevant agency that was involved in those cases won 60% of the time. So you can see how a lot of industry is more conservative leaning groups are coming out and saying, look, this really expanded the executive branch's authority beyond likely what Congress had intended. Now Congress really isn't incentivized to do its job. It doesn't really have political will to actually write more specific legislation. And the judiciary also is kind of weakened because they are not, when they're looking at these cases, they're not interpreting the statute for themselves. They are just, when it's ambiguous, saying, well, if the agency is reasonable, we're good to go. So that's why this case is so incredibly important. And it really acts that 40 years of precedent. And now we're starting back from a new start. The case has only been on the books for about, I think, 6 weeks. Was decided in July. So there are a lot of open-ended questions, but where we find ourselves now with the Loper-Bright decision is that courts may not defer to an agency interpretation of law simply because the statute is ambiguous. Courts really need and only have the sole competency to resolve that ambiguity within the statute. And so deference gone when you're thinking about what the law says. So the judiciary now must exercise independent judgment in determining the meaning of a statute's provision. They can consider an agency's interpretation that may aid their decision, but it can't control it anymore. The court's analysis has to be independent. So that is a big change, right? But what I've been sort of reading and listening to other legal scholars talk about, now that sort of trigger of ambiguity, getting deference is gone, but where are the new lines drawn? So there's now this distinction of, if you're just interpreting the statute and what the law means, that could really rise and fall on a particular judge or court's decision. And as we know, judges have different personalities, different ways of looking at the law. So there will be some, jockeying throughout the United States on these cases of where that comes out. And so you're not necessarily ensured a favorable outcome just because the decision has now been taken out of the agency's hands and put into a court. We have a lot of district judges that are not favorable to the mining industry, particularly coal. So you can imagine, if some of these cases come before them, will we get a better outcome? We don't know. Only time will tell. And then there's this distinction of, well, are they really interpreting the law, or are they applying the statute? Did Congress give them the discretion to apply that statute to fill some gap that Congress didn't fill for them? And are they really supplying the law to the facts? Because if you're talking about fact finding, then the agency still does have discretion in that sort of realm of cases. And I've seen this recently. A National Mining Association is involved in a lawsuit on EPA's particulate matter national ambient air quality standards. And EPA this week filed their opposition brief to our lawsuit. And in that, they said, look, Loper doesn't matter. We have an extreme, and I put that in quotes, extreme level of deference in this case, and how we decided to lower the particulate matter standards so significantly. And Loper doesn't change that situation. This is their legal argument in their brief. And that when it comes to them applying sort of a technically based factual determination that's made by their expertise and their science and technical documents, in that case, they deserve extreme deference. So I think this will be a really interesting case to see how the DC Circuit responds to that, because Loper, each agency is going to either say, I have the best reading of the statute, and hope that the court, as they're thinking about that themselves, that the briefing that the agency put forward persuades the court to take their best reading of the statute. Or in this case, in the PMNAC's case, are we talking about how they're applying it on the ground to change a particular standard? So there's a lot of unknowns about how this is going to play out. I'll give you another example. In the Waters of the United States regulation, each administration has changed that definition. We've been ping-ponging back and forth between what a Republican administration wants to do, which is narrow jurisdiction, to a Democratic administration that expands it. The Supreme Court comes in, tries to set, the law about what's in and out. And we still have, an agency under the Biden administration that still wants to expand even past what the Supreme Court said. Well, we filed 2 briefs in Texas and North Dakota recently that said, look, there's no discretion to the agency. They've been flip-flopping back and forth between administrations. It is time for these courts to decide where that jurisdictional line is. So I think, you've got to look at what case you're bringing up. You've got to look at the statute. But the agency, is pushing back on Loper, and they are trying to operate and still defend their policies regardless of what Loper says. Happy to answer any questions, John, about that, or if I can provide more context to that.
Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of questions, and obviously open for questions from the group too. But before I go deep on the questions, one of the questions I've been getting a lot that maybe we could put it to rest is people are saying, well, does this Chevron decision from the Supreme Court undo any regulations that are already done?
No, it does not. And in fact, the court did address the fact that, there are many cases on the books where Chevron was applied, and those court cases stay. So essentially, future cases on future interpretations of law, we'll see how Loper plays out. But it does not call into question prior cases that relied on the Chevron framework. And within the Supreme Court opinion, it talked about there needs to be some sort of special justification that would be required before court could go back and revisit prior case law. But there was really no, from what I've read, details about what that special justification would be. Now, there's an interesting other case, Corner Post, that came out at the same time that talked about the statute of limitations, about bringing a case, 6-year statute of limitations. That company, came in, it was I think a 2011 debit fee charge that was applied, and that truck stop came in 2018 and sued, and it was cut down with the court saying, no, it's past the 6 years for when that regulation went in, and Supreme Court said, actually, that statute of limitations doesn't begin to run when until the plaintiff is actually complete and present and can bring the case. And so there are some questions of, if you have a new business and the statute of limitations starts when your business is now regulated, can they go back and sue and try to upend a, unfavorable Chevron decision? And we haven't seen that play out yet. And some of the environmental statutes, right, have more specific, not 6 years, but 60, 90 days to bring a case. So the combination of those cases has opened up some interesting questions and maybe opportunities for new businesses to maybe try to make some change.
Interesting. So one of the other things I think might be interesting to let people know, I mean, we're mainly concerned with environmental cases, right? In the coal side of the business, different cases go to different courts, right? I mean, solid waste has to go to the DC Circuit Court. Some other air and water cases can go to the federal regional courts, which makes everybody run to the courthouse and try to shop for the best venue.
Right.
Can you kind of describe to us how, which cases go where, and how, I mean, some circuits or some judges may be more amenable to giving up on the Chevron deference than others. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. As you mentioned, the statute really dictates where you go. And if not, you can venue shop. So, WOTUS is in many different district courts. Most of your National Clean Air Act regulations have to be in the DC Circuit. We recently filed a challenge on the Bureau of Land Management's Landscape and Conservation and Health Rule. We didn't have to go to a particular circuit. We actually went to a district court in Wyoming that we thought would be favorable to the cause. So it really is subject matter specific. And I think, If you are able to choose the court where you want to raise your claims, there could be judges that would be more favorable in applying the new Loper Bright standards than others. The DC Circuit's a challenge, right? We'll see what happens there because the agencies will continue to really defend their policy choices regardless of Loper.
And that's the illustration you gave on the PM case that's over there now,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, I guess that's the practical question. The Supreme Court has said, you know, Chevron deference isn't an automatic anymore, but could a panel of liberal judges on the DC Circuit buy that argument from the EPA that yeah, I'm going to give them deference anyway. It's
Right. I think that their reading is the best reading, and I agree with that. Is essentially what they would say. I don't know that they will ever use the word deference again, but we'll see.
but they still may be politically inclined that way. You also mentioned that, you know, when Chevron first came out 40 years ago under the Reagan administration, this was good for industry at that point, right? Because we'd been at that point the courts were loaded up with judges having been appointed over 20 or 30 years of, you know, pretty much democratic sovereignty over Congress and the White House for the most part. And so industry saw, you know, giving deference to agencies as being favorable to a super liberal judiciary. And then over the 40 years, it flipped around the other way. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, when I looked at the stats, you know, the Circuit Court of Appeals reference Chevron, I think over 18,000 times, right, since it was put into place as a doctrine. Um, and you know, I talked to some folks here, you know, at National Mining Association didn't file an amicus brief in these cases because the mining industry has won and lost on Chevron. Maybe not equally, maybe we lost more than we won. But there was some wiggle room, right? If you had a favorable Republican administration that was willing to make different decisions and change policies more in favor of the mining industry, you know, some of those were upheld. And now you're going to find yourself potentially in this scenario where these statutory questions, these questions of law are going to come up in the judiciary. The judiciary is going to decide that and say maybe that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court again on a particular issue and a particular statute, but that will be the law, right? So a new administration coming in won't be able to make its own policy choices because it will be set for them. So it'll also be interesting to see how that plays out, particularly if we do have a Republican administration next year. How does that impact their ability to reverse some of the policy decisions that were made in the Biden administration?
Right. So maybe we'll come back to that in just a second and talk about, you know, maybe which of this tranche of Biden rules that have come out are more vulnerable at this point. But before we leave that whole idea of Congress's role in this whole thing, I mean, with Chevron gone, I mean, this probably should be a signal to Congress to write more specific laws, right?
Mhm.
Is that possible though?
I was listening to a really interesting webinar recently where the conversation was about the political will of Congress to write more specific laws. And I think there was some strong skepticism that that would happen, particularly because if you want a bipartisan bill, that often cannot be very specific, or it's written in a way where each side thinks they won, right? That their interpretation will win the day after the law is enacted and the executive branch is implementing it. I've read articles about how Congress needs to really staff up on their legislative writing teams because they do need to get more specific. I've also, you know, heard folks say maybe this will not result in more specific legislation, but Congress will be more explicit in delegating authority to the executive branch, even though, you know, some more conservative justices might think that's not in their authority to do under the Constitution. So it's a lot of unknowns, right? But we know how hard it is to get anything done on Capitol Hill. I can't imagine more explicit legislation with more specifics is really possible in the short term at all.
Right?
But
So
maybe I'm
we're
a pessimistic or just a
so
realist. You
well.
can tell me.
Some of us think the glass is half full. Some of us think it's half empty. Some of us think the glass is half trying to kill us. So it's we fit somewhere on that spectrum, right? But I agree with you. The idea that Congress is suddenly going to be crystal clear about how these laws work is probably not it. So we're stuck dealing with the courts for a while, or for forever. I mean, a regulation gets passed, no matter which way it goes, somebody's going to sue, and off you go. So with that in mind, I mean, the Biden administration has pumped out, am I wrong to say, an unprecedented amount of regulations in the last, let's say, 9 months, trying to get ahead of the Congressional Review Act and so forth. Which of and in my reading, non-lawyer reading of the tea leaves, a lot of those regulations are pretty aggressive, like way beyond probably what Congress intended. So, I mean, is there of those rules? I mean, can you name a few that you think maybe most vulnerable to being overturned by the courts? And does Chevron help in that regard?
Sure. Just a little stat for everybody. The American Action Forum puts out a statistic every week where they go through the Federal Register and calculate the costs of rules that are put out by all administrations. And this administration is now in over $1 trillion of regulatory burden. Like, it's insane how much, and that is magnitudes of order above even what the Obama administration did in 2 terms. So that's really interesting and something that we track for our members on cases. Chevron is going to play a role in the WOTUS litigation for sure. It's popping up. It's going to pop up in the Clean Power Plan 2.0 litigation. Interestingly, the Supreme Court hasn't relied on Chevron in almost a decade. They've been whittling it down, and major questions doctrine came out on Clean Power Plan, the original one, saying, you can't regulate beyond what Congress explicitly gave you, particularly on significant issues of national importance. I think that Clean Power Plan 2.0 will have a combination of major questions doctrine and also Chevron. And I mean, Loper, I should call it Loper now. We're also litigating the ozone transport rule. We've got to stay in the Supreme Court, which was a huge success this past summer. So that rule is on ice. I think that's going to turn more on the statute itself and what EPA is authorized to do. That whole issue is about over control on ozone emissions that cross into downwind states and affect how they're able to meet certain Clean Air Act standards. Trying to think of the other cases that we're involved in. Some of these cases that we just filed, Loper is so brand new that we haven't necessarily kind of thought through to the end of how we're going to include that in briefs, but it's certainly popping up right now, and a lot of reply briefs in the opposition briefs that EPA is filing. So we'll see. I know that's kind of not an answer to your question, but I just don't know that anyone knows what the level of success will be in any particular case with Loper Bright now on the books.
Right. Rightly or wrongly, I've been making the case that the current EPA has been pursuing a Gina McCarthy-inspired win by losing strategy of proposing really extreme rules, knowing they're probably going to get overturned at some point by the courts, but also knowing that it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years to run the gamut of litigation. And by the time you get to that being overturned, the damage has already been inflicted on the coal industry. I mean, that worked with the Mercury rule back in the 18s, and one could say that it's working now with some of these. So that issue of whether the court stays a regulation while the litigation works itself out is probably as important to our industry as whether it ultimately succeeds or fails. So the ozone rule has been stayed. You know, what are the prospects for some of these other rules to get stayed? Clean Power 2.0 carbon rule is a big one.
Yeah, so huge success on the ozone transport rule stay. That was a very nuanced case. Not to get into the weeds, but I think it piqued the Supreme Court's interest because the rule was based on having 23 states involved in this nationwide program. But the only reason why those 23 states were in it was because EPA had denied their state implementation plans. And then a whole slew of regional courts said, actually, no, we're going to put those on hold. So now that 23 state plan turned into an 11 state plan. 70% of the emissions that were supposed to be covered by the plan were thrown out because of those regional stays. So that was a very specific case that really got the Supreme Court's attention because EPA did not address a significant part of the problem with their rule. They just said, oh, it doesn't matter. And we're not going to explain why it doesn't matter and why all of our analyses, still are rational. I think we have a good chance at getting a stay on the Clean Power Plan, but that's a totally different animal, right? That's really about whether or not the court's going to be convinced that this is just another version of generation shifting that is not allowed under the Clean Air Act, as they said in West Virginia v. EPA.
Which was
I
Clean
think,
Power 1.0, right? Which was
yep,
stayed by the Supreme Court.
exactly. So we're trying really hard. We are asking for a stay. EPA is opposing the stay, saying this isn't a major question. We're using the Clean Air Act to apply technologies to coal plants like CCS, 90% CCS, which has never been demonstrated in the world, and saying this is really more of a technical record-based decision that EPA made based on its own authority. You can never predict what the Supreme Court is going to do. In fact, after I attended the Supreme Court hearing on the ozone transport rule and left thinking, oh, we got this. And I told my members we got this. And then that was February. And then we were waiting and waiting. I'm like, oh God, we didn't get this. I just told my members we got this. So I am not going to predict this time. I'm hopeful that we will get a stay. But when you talk about stays, the DC Circuit, you put your stay request in, denied, denied, denied. And what you said about the mercury air toxic standards, I was just reading, we're actually going to ask the Supreme Court to stay the MATS rule. We've joined a coalition of utility industry sector, and that's going to be filed later this week. But we point out to the court, like, look, the last time this happened, it took so long for this case to get decided. 20% of the coal fleet retired. So EPA eventually still got what it wanted under the ground, even though the rule was unlawful.
Well,
So really,
20% retired, and the 80% that didn't spent hundreds of millions of dollars implementing controls that made the resource less economical
right,
on a rule that was ultimately struck down. So EPA won two ways, right?
right. And as you said, Gina McCarthy boasted about that.
Right.
Oh, this decision doesn't matter. We got what we wanted on the ground anyway. That's why it is so incredibly important to get these stays, because these cases can be heard and decided within a year and a half if they're on an expedited schedule. There are no harms to the public for putting these things on ice while we make sure that EPA has done its job. Particularly on the mercury and air toxic standards rule, they couldn't even come up with any benefits of that rule, but they want to impose another like 900 million on the industry to, install additional controls to control filterable PM and mercury by 67 and 70%. So it's really, these days are really, really necessary for the coal industry and coal plants moving forward.
So is NMA, seeking a stay on all the rules, or how do you probably don't have that much bandwidth, right? How do you determine which rules you're going to go ask for a stay on and which ones we're just going to live with?
Well, all of the power plant sector rules that we are involved in, which is ozone transport rule, Clean Power Plan 2.0, and Mercury, we are asking the Supreme Court, or asked the Supreme Court, for a stay. So that was always part of the litigation strategy, knowing that you're going to get nowhere in the DC circuit, that you would have to go straight to the Supreme Court afterwards.
Right. Cool.
And I'm sure the parties that are involved in the ELG could, potentially do the same thing. We're not involved in the fluid limitation guidelines case.
Right. And that brings me to another point. I mean, our group tends to be more focused on EPA and STB, for environmental and transportation policy. You guys do a whole bunch of other stuff at BLM and Interior and all those other kind of things. Maybe if you can just give, before we move on, just kind of an overview of what other threats are out there, because we've talked a lot about, the torrent of rules coming out of EPA, but they've been coming out of other agencies as well, right?
Right. I think for a big bucket item is permitting, right? Recently, the S&P put out a report that said on average it takes 29 years to permit a mine in the United States, second to Zambia. So the amount of time it takes to permit a mine here is, it's ludicrous. And a lot of that is driven by the number of permits that you need to have, how long that permit system takes, and then you have to pile on the litigation on top, because every permit is challenged by the environmental and conservation community. So that report that came out this summer was really an eye-opener and really helps to support our advocacy on permitting reform. And I know that that the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee pulled out of committee their permitting bill, which, does make some great strides for not only minerals mining, but coal mining. And if folks aren't familiar with that bill, it has judicial review reforms, so limiting the amount of time that you can challenge permits, expedited court review, and other things that help with that sort of litigation piece that tacks on so much time in the permitting process. For the coal industry, it has some electric transmission provisions. It has a whole provision on electric reliability, where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation would assess the future federal regulations that are significantly impacting power plants and have more input into that process. So that was a big outcome in this Congress, how late we are in this, term that came out this summer. We don't know where that's going. The plans for moving that to the Senate floor are uncertain at this time, as far as I'm aware. But that was something that we've worked hard on, not only in the Senate, but we've worked on permitting reform throughout, Senate, House, multiple iterations of these bills. HR 1 over in the House was like a big permitting package. This one that just passed in the Senate committee was, smaller, but trying to push permitting reform is really important. I think the other issue is simply access. This administration, particularly for coal leasing, from a coal leasing moratorium to now we are seeing these resource management plans being finalized in North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, where they are essentially cutting off coal leasing in the future and using those resource management plans to put these regional moratorium on coal to stop coal from expanding out west. So that's something that we are really engaged in. We've protested 2 of those resource management plans. We're preparing to protest in September the recent resource management plan that came out for North Dakota. But if you, are a coal mine that's operating on public lands, and you only have so many leases operating until, I don't know, 6, 7, 10 years from now, and you can't expand because you can't get any more leases, that's really going to change, your business structure and how long that you can remain operating for your customers.
Right. Great. We will, Steve, we'll get to your question here in just a minute. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer it, but we'll get to it in just a minute. Just reminding folks, though, that, we're past the top of the hour. We'll probably wrap it up here in the next 10 minutes or so. So if you do have questions or anything you'd like to throw out there to discuss, feel free to raise your hand or put something into the chat box. before we turn to questions from the gallery, well, let me ask one more thing on that permitting reform. I mean, the Senate permitting reform bill that passed committee, that's nominally bipartisan, right? I mean, you've got
It is,
Barrasso from Wyoming and Manchin from West Virginia
correct.
on that. I mean, after HR1, is there any path forward on this through the House, or do we have to wait for a bigger House majority in one form or another?
In talking to my colleagues, I don't think there's enough time to get something through the House, and I think you do need a better sort of dynamic up there
Right.
between the political parties on the House side.
So we are, practically speaking, for anything legislatively at this point, we're looking at the next Congress, correct?
Yes, which is unfortunate because that means starting over, right? But we will see.
Right. We never start over. One other, kind of shifting gears for a minute. NCTA runs one of the areas we've cooperated a lot with NMA over the past few years, particularly during the Great Railroad Service Meltdown of 2021 to whatever that ran. NCTA does an on-time performance survey. We'll be reporting on the most recent round of that coming up here at the September conference, and at the RETAC committees at STB this also in September. But NMA runs a survey as well of your members. I mean, just what are your members saying about rail service now? Has it gotten better for them, or are you still hearing complaints anywhere?
Not huge complaints. I think from talking to my colleagues and looking at the survey results, it looks like it's okay. Like it hasn't gotten worse. Maybe in some instances it's maintained. I think there's still challenges with certain issues involving wildfires and flooding and crews not being available or power loss with the trains that are still impacting things, but I don't think it's gotten worse. The other factor, I think that many responses were just coal demand is down at the moment, and so that also plays into it. We'll see what happens when things kind of tick up with, ag this fall, and then, winter. How bad is winter going to be? How much is, heat going to go up and demand's going to go up? And will that change the dynamic with the rails? We'll see.
I guess that's a valid question. How much of the service improvements that we have seen are attributable to the fact that we're just not moving as much coal this year?
Right.
So, one of the points that NCTA makes in the latest round of comments that we filed on this railroad growth hearing is that during that service crisis, you had literally millions of tons of coal that could have been used that weren't, and there's no way to ever get that back. I mean, that's just gone, lost opportunity. And so, yeah, that is a real question as to whether they can. Back to the reason for the STB holding these growth hearings is, yeah, you're doing better but what happens the next time there's a crisis, the next time there's a bump in demand? So we'll see where that goes. All right, Steve, we're going to get to your question. I'm just going to throw it at Tanya and see if she's got an answer for this. What's your readings on regulatory approval of the Arch Console deal in an election year?
Oh, no comment.
I thought that might be the case. Are there coal transportation implications to I guess that one's more directed to me, coal transportation implications related to an Arch Console consolidation. This isn't an official opinion of NCTA. This would be just a personal observation, but I don't know that the corporate consolidation changes the dynamics of how producers and utilities deal with their railroads. I mean, the mines are all going to still be in the same place. They're going to be working with the same end markets. I don't think anything about a consolidation on the coal producer side of the industry changes the dynamic of how well the rail networks work, or whether the rail networks are configured to handle our very large commodity that we think might get large again. at some point. It's been clearly a down year, but you know, it doesn't take long, as we saw back in 21, it doesn't take long for the shoe to go on the other foot. Yeah, natural gas prices tick up, droughts, you know, premature plant closures, all those factors could result in things coming back.
And export markets potentially increasing, right?
Right. Steve also asks about the Canadian strike that may happen tomorrow. Have you followed that at all, Tony? I've been following it.
So my colleague Katie Mills has, and she's been keeping me up to date, and she's reaching out to our members. At the moment, we're not hearing any major impacts to our folks. From what I was told, that, you know, the class 1 carriers in the US have issued service advisories and potential embargoes. I'm sure, John, you're following that. But it doesn't seem to be impacting our members yet, or if at all. So
Yeah,
more to
I think,
come.
yeah, well, and we'll see where it goes. I think my view on it is, yeah, I mean, we're doing the dance that you always do when you come to one of these lockout/strike situations. It's the same thing that played out, 2 years ago in the fall when we almost had a strike here in the US. You know, the railroads have embargoed a week ago hazardous materials because they don't want, you know, tank cars of chlorine winding up in somebody's backyard and not being able to move anywhere. You know, I know the intermodal folks are really worked up over this because there is a lot more. Yeah, there's not a lot of coal traffic that moves on the Canadian railroads. The bulk of the coal traffic moves on, you know, on the four big ones, you know, the two duopolies on the two sides of the country here. The Canadian railroads kind of run up the middle. So they touch coal, but not as much. The intermodal folks are starting to freak out. And on top of that, for the intermodal folks, is we're also looking at potentially a longshoreman strike on the at some of the ports on the East Coast. And I haven't been able to figure out yet if that has any impact on the coal export terminals. But the intermodal people are starting to freak out about a potential Canadian strike plus strikes at the ports. So the Canadian ports have you know, radioed to the container ship traffic that's headed this direction and told them to slow down. You know, we don't want to wind up with you know, a traffic jam like they had at the Panama Canal last year. So you know, this one wouldn't have been, you know, I think that to answer Steve's question, personal opinion, Canadian rail strike wouldn't be as scary to the coal industry as the US rail strike was a couple of years ago. But obviously it has ripple effects that go through the whole network. And the prevailing wisdom is that, you know, the Canadian government, even though Parliament is out of session right now, you know, the Canadian government can't really allow something like this to go on for very long. So, you know, if a strike does happen, you know, how long before the government steps in, as they did in the United States, and fixes it by forcing everybody back to work. The general consensus out there is that if they lock out tomorrow, it may be you know, for a few days rather than a few weeks. But I guess we'll see what Prime Minister Trudeau is able to work out of all of this. So hope that was responsive. And we'll have a little bit about the strike and the on track tomorrow too, but it's going to be late breaking news because we're publishing a newsletter the same day that the Canadian railroads are talking about putting padlocks on the gates. So we'll see what happens. Any other questions from the group? Tawny, how about you? What have I missed? Is there anything else that NMA is up to that you'd like to cover?
No, I think we covered it, John. It's been a
No.
really busy year. So litigation is what I'm mostly focused on these days. So trying to beat back those regulations and give some reprieve to the industry.
That brings one more question to mind. So let's play the thought experiment. Let's say there's regime change in the November elections. You have Trump 2.0 coming in January. This litigation we've talked about extensively today plays out. Does that improve the industry's litigation position because the new management at the agencies maybe isn't as vested in the rules they're defending?
So we can expect on day one, if there is a Trump administration, that they will put a hold on anything that's in process, right? Nothing will get finalized. And for those rules that have been finalized, can imagine they'll have some sort of executive order about urgent, telling the executive branch that they need to review and revise as appropriate all these rules, and they will target many of them, including the Clean Power Plan, which President Trump mentioned in a Pennsylvania rally, I think yesterday. Usually what happens in litigation when a new administration comes in and says they are reconsidering a rule, those cases will be put on ice. They will be put into abeyance. So we've seen in some of the litigation that we are involved in now, particularly on the Clean Power Plan, we are on an extremely expedited schedule where briefing will end before November. I haven't seen anything happen so quickly because the administration is trying to get oral argument on the books before a regime change so that they can then not have that happen, right? So that the case will be decided by a court and not be held in abeyance. So if you can get oral argument out past January, you're more likely to have those cases be put on ice because a Republican administration will reconsider and reverse those rules and do something else with them. So yeah, we're spending a lot of money right now on these cases, and depending on the election, they might be put on hold.
Interesting.
But that's okay, because it gives the Republican administration a chance to do something different that would be more favorable to industry.
And it's as good as a stay for the purposes of, the win by losing strategy, right? So
Right.
interesting. All right. Well, yeah, I appreciate that. So, well, I don't see any more questions on the other. Tawny, thank you so much for taking time out of your
Yep.
busy schedule to chat with us about all this good stuff. Melinda, do you have anything you want to chime in at the end there?
And I will clarify one thing, John. The stays are still important because even if the cases are put into abeyance and those effective dates are still on the books while the administration revisits them, that's why the stays are so important. Because without those stays, the clock keeps ticking.
Clock keeps ticking. Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. Thank you for clarifying that. So great. Well, Tawny, thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. We appreciate it very much. We're gonna end it a little early. It's my new favorite phrase in the Zoom world time, which is I'm going to give you back 7 minutes, like I owned it to begin with. So appreciate everybody chiming in today. If you're not registered for Tucson, do so. We're gonna have a good time September 10 and 11. Reach out to Melinda with your sponsorships. And we will not be having an On Track Live webinar during September because you're supposed to come to Tucson and shake our hands and talk to us in person. But we'll be back with On Track Live again in October and moving into the rest of the year. So watch the On Track newsletter for announcements on our next speakers. So thanks a bunch, everybody. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.